The sun crept slowly over the horizon, casting a warm glow across Oakwood Park. The morning air was crisp, filled with the gentle chirping of birds and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. The park was serene, almost magical, as the first rays of sunlight touched the well-maintained paths and the neatly trimmed hedges. Amidst this peaceful scene sat Mr. Charles Thompson, an elderly black man in his late 70s, enjoying the stillness of the morning. Charles sat comfortably on his favorite bench, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The rich aroma of the brew mixed with the fresh scent of morning dew, making this moment feel like his sanctuary. His cane, worn smooth from years of use, lay by his side as he unfolded a newspaper across his lap. This was his daily ritual, a time to reflect and savor the simple pleasures of life. With his calm demeanor and kind eyes, Charles was a familiar and beloved figure in the park. Every morning, he arrived early, well before the joggers, dog walkers, and families with strollers filled the paths. Today was no different. As he took a sip of his coffee, the sunlight caught the silver in his close-cropped hair, giving him an almost ethereal glow. His attire was modest, but neat, a pressed shirt tucked into worn slacks, and a light jacket to ward off the morning chill. Despite his age, Charles carried a quiet strength, a dignity earned through a lifetime of experience. It was a typical morning, with Charles looking forward to the solitude of the park before the hustle and bustle of the day. He often found comfort in the quiet moments, using them to clear his mind and reflect on the changing world around him. The trees around him, which had stood tall for decades, were like old friends, providing shade and familiarity. He had witnessed the park transform over the years, from a neglected patch of land to the beautifully maintained space it had become. But to Charles, it was more than just a park. It was a symbol of community, of progress, and of the countless memories he had made over the years. But not everyone saw him that way. On this particular morning, the peace in the park would soon be broken by an unexpected visitor. A young police officer, Daniels, strode into the park with an air of authority. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming in the sunlight, and his eyes darted around the park, scanning for anything out of place. When they settled on Charles, they lingered, narrowing with suspicion. Officer Daniels approached Charles with a quick stride, his hand resting casually on the holster at his waist. "Excuse me, sir." His voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet air. Charles looked up from his paper, his brow furrowed in mild confusion. "Good morning, officer," he said calmly, setting the paper aside. "What can I do for you?" Daniels didn't waste any time. "Do you live around here?" he asked, his tone authoritative, his stance rigid. Charles blinked in surprise. "Yes, I do," he replied. "Just a few blocks down. I've lived in this neighborhood for over 30 years. The officer's eyes narrowed further. "I haven't seen you around before," he replied, his voice laced with suspicion. "Can you prove that you live here?" Charles felt a flicker of something. Not fear, but a familiar tightness in his chest. He took a breath, willing himself to remain calm. "Officer, I've been coming to this park every morning for decades. I'm not sure what kind of proof you're looking for, but I assure you, I belong here." Daniels crossed his arms, his posture becoming more confrontational. "This is a residential area," he said. "If you can't prove you live here, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The question, though phrased as a demand, hung in the air, heavy with implication. Charles could feel the atmosphere shift, tension rising with each passing second. He knew this script all too well, a script he had lived through many times in his life. He took another breath, his voice steady. "Officer, I'm not loitering, I'm just enjoying my morning, like I do every day." Daniels didn't seem satisfied. "I don't have time for this," he snapped, his tone becoming sharper. "If you can't prove you live here, you need to move along. Now." Charles, maintaining his composure, glanced around the park. The usual crowd of morning joggers and dog walkers had begun to filter in, but no one seemed to notice the exchange. Or if they did, they pretended not to. The park had always been a place of peace for Charles. But today it felt different. It felt like the weight of history was pressing down on him again, the old familiar struggles resurfacing. Yet, what Officer Daniels didn't realize was that someone had been watching. Someone sitting quietly on a nearby bench, partially obscured by the shade of a tree, had taken note of everything unfolding before them. This silent observer was more than just another park-goer, more than just a casual bystander. They were a witness to what was happening, and soon enough, their presence would change everything. But for now, they remained still, watching, waiting. As Officer Daniels slunk away toward the station, Chief Mitchell's eyes lingered on him for a moment longer, shaking his head in disbelief. Turning back to Charles, the chief's stern expression softened into one of regret. "Raymond," Charles said quietly, resting his hand on the cane. "You know, it's not just about today. It's not just about me. I've been fighting these kinds of battles my whole life." The chief nodded, his jaw tightening as the weight of Charles's words sunk in. "I know," he replied, lowering himself onto the bench beside Charles. "And it's frustrating that even with all the reforms we've made, incidents like this still happen." The two men sat in silence for a few moments, the tension slowly dissipating from the air. Birds chirped in the trees above, and the sun continued its slow rise, casting long, golden shadows across the park. "I grew up admiring you," Chief Mitchell said suddenly, his voice low. "I remember when you spoke at the dedication ceremony for this park. My father took me to it, said I needed to see what true leadership looks like. I was just a kid, but I've never forgotten that day. Seeing a man like you, who had every reason to be bitter about the world, still standing up and fighting for unity, it shaped a lot of who I am today." Charles turned to look at Mitchell, his face softening. "You've done good work, Raymond. Your father would be proud, but we both know there's still so much left to do." Mitchell nodded, his gaze distant as he surveyed the park. "There's still a lot of systemic issues to address, and it's not just about training, it's about changing how people think. Daniels didn't wake up this morning planning to harass an elderly man. He was acting on biases he probably didn't even realize he had." Charles sighed, rubbing his temples. "That's the thing, though. Those biases, they're deadly. They destroy lives, families, communities, and they can't be ignored." Chief Mitchell leaned back on the bench, his hands clasped together. "I know. I see it, and I'm trying. We're all trying. But it's a slow process, too slow if you ask me. We can implement all the policies and training in the world, but if we don't get to the root of the problem, how people see each other, then we're just putting band-aids on bullet wounds." Charles nodded in agreement, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had heard these promises before. "What happened today, Raymond, is just another reminder that we can't be complacent. We have to keep pushing, keep educating. And we need people like you, in positions of power, to make sure these changes aren't just cosmetic." Mitchell met Charles's gaze, his eyes filled with determination. "I promise you, Charles, this won't be swept under the rug. Officer Daniels is going to face real consequences, and not just him. The entire department is going to learn from this." Charles looked away, his eyes scanning the park, the trees, the families starting to gather for their daily routines. "I hope you're right," he said softly, "because we've come too far to let things slide now." Mitchell stood up, his body language resolute. "You'll see. This isn't just talk. I'll make sure of it." Charles nodded appreciatively, though he remained seated. "Thank you, Raymond, and if there's anything I can do to help, you know where to find me." Chief Mitchell smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "We might just take you up on that, Charles. We could use more people like you. This fight isn't over." With that, Mitchell walked away, leaving Charles alone on the bench, lost in thought. The morning had started so peacefully, so quietly, but now it felt like a storm had passed through, one that had left more damage than anyone could see. Charles closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the park wash over him. The laughter of children, the barking of dogs, the rustle of leaves. It was all so familiar, so comforting. Yet beneath it all, there was an undercurrent of tension, a reminder that even in the most peaceful of places, battles were still being fought. As he opened his eyes, he noticed several people glancing in his direction, joggers who had slowed down, families who were casting cautious looks toward him, as if wondering what had just happened. Charles sighed deeply. The park had always been a refuge for him, a place where he could find a little peace. But now, it felt tainted by the morning's events. He bent down, picking up his newspaper, but his hands trembled slightly as he did so. The stress of the encounter had left him feeling more drained than he cared to admit. His heart condition was manageable, but moments like this, moments of confrontation and stress, reminded him of his limits. Just as he was about to stand up and leave, a young woman approached him, her face full of concern. She couldn't have been more than 25, her athletic gear suggesting she was out for a morning jog. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice gentle. "I saw what happened earlier. Are you okay?" Charles looked up at her, surprised by the kindness in her voice. "I'm fine," he replied, though the exhaustion in his eyes told a different story. "I just wanted to say," she continued, glancing nervously around, "that what that officer did, it wasn't right. I'm sorry you had to go through that." Charles gave her a small, weary smile. "Thank you. But you don't have to apologize. It's not your fault." The young woman shifted uncomfortably. "Still, it's not fair. You didn't do anything wrong, and it's just frustrating, you know?" Charles nodded, understanding her frustration all too well. "It is frustrating," he said quietly. "But it's not new. It's something I've lived with for a long time." The woman bit her lip, clearly upset by his words. "Well, I just wanted to say, I respect you for how you handled it. You didn't deserve that." Charles nodded appreciatively, his heart warming slightly at the stranger's kindness. "Thank you," he said again. "It means more than you know." With a final nod, the young woman jogged away, leaving Charles once again alone with his thoughts. He sat there for a while longer, staring out at the park, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. The morning had been difficult, but it wasn't the end. There would be more mornings like this, more moments of confrontation, but also more moments of hope. And as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, whether it was a police chief or a young jogger, then perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance for things to truly change. As Raymond Mitchell walked away, Charles remained seated, watching the young police chief disappear into the distance. The weight of the morning's event still lingered, but there was a newfound sense of relief in knowing that someone in power had taken notice, and more importantly, that this person understood the deep-seated issues that needed to be addressed. Charles leaned back on the bench, his mind drifting to the past. He had fought so many battles for equality and justice over the years, both big and small. The civil rights marches, the protests, the countless meetings with city officials, pushing for basic rights that had been denied to him and others for far too long. And yet here he was, decades later, still facing the same challenges. He sighed deeply, rubbing the worn handle of his cane with his thumb. "How many more of these fights do I have left in me?" he wondered. The thought of passing the torch to the next generation was comforting, but at the same time, it was bittersweet. He had spent his entire life trying to build a better world for the people who came after him, and while progress had been made, the road ahead still seemed long and difficult. Just as Charles was about to stand up and leave the park, a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Thompson?" Charles looked up to see a small group of people standing a few feet away. One of them, a young woman with braided hair and a clipboard in hand, smiled warmly at him. "We've been looking for you," she said. "I'm part of the local advocacy group, and we've been following what happened this morning with Officer Daniels. Word travels fast around here." Charles raised an eyebrow, surprised but not entirely shocked by how quickly the news had spread. Seems like nothing stays quiet for long these days, he remarked with a wry smile. The young woman chuckled softly. No, it doesn't. We're actually gathering signatures for a petition to increase accountability in the police department, and we'd love to have your support. I know you've done so much for this community already, but your voice would make a huge difference. Charles studied the faces of the group standing before him. They were young, passionate, and full of energy, exactly the kind of people who would carry the fight forward after he was gone. The woman with the clipboard extended a pen toward him, her eyes filled with hope. After a brief pause, Charles took the pen and signed the petition with a steady hand. I'm glad to see young folks like you stepping up, he said, handing the clipboard back. The work isn't done yet, and it's going to take all of us to get to where we need to be. The group thanked him profusely, and one of the young men, a tall, lanky guy wearing a worn-out hoodie, spoke up. You're a legend around here, Mr. Thompson. People still talk about what you did for this park, and how you fought for civil rights when it wasn't easy. We want to make sure your legacy isn't forgotten. Charles smiled, though there was a touch of sadness in his eyes. Legacy, he repeated, his voice soft. It's not about what I leave behind. It's about what we build together, what we pass on to those who come next. And from what I'm seeing here today, you all are doing just that. As the group left, Charles sat quietly for a few moments longer, absorbing the significance of what had just happened. The torch was indeed being passed, and while the road ahead would still be difficult, there was a new generation ready to take up the fight. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees around him, and Charles closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. Oakwood Park had always been a place of refuge for him, a sanctuary where he could find peace amidst the chaos of life. And now, it seemed, it was becoming something more, a symbol of resilience, of unity, and of the ongoing struggle for justice. He opened his eyes and looked around. Children were playing on the swings, their laughter filling the air. Parents sat on benches, chatting and enjoying the fresh morning. A few joggers passed by, nodding in his direction as they went. The park, for all its history, was still a place where life continued, where people could come together, no matter their background. Just then, a man in his 40s, dressed in a worn suit, approached Charles. His face was weathered, and his steps were hesitant, but there was a determination in his gaze. Mr. Thompson, the man said, clearing his throat nervously. I don't know if you remember me, but my father used to work with you at the community center. He always talked about how much you taught him about standing up for what's right. When I heard what happened this morning, I just wanted to come by and say thank you. Charles tilted his head slightly, his mind searching for the connection. The man's face held a vague familiarity, and after a moment, it clicked. You're Robert's son, aren't you? Charles asked, his tone softening. The man nodded, his expression a mix of pride and emotion. Yes, sir. Robert Washington. My father passed away a few years ago, but before he died, he told me to always look to you for guidance. He said you were one of the bravest men he'd ever known. Charles's heart swelled with both pride and sadness. Robert had been a dear friend, a fellow activist who had stood by his side during some of the most difficult battles. Your father was a good man, Charles said, his voice thick with emotion. We fought hard together for this community, and I'm glad to see you carrying on his legacy. The man smiled, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'm trying, Mr. Thompson. I'm trying to do what he would have done. And after seeing what happened to you today, it just made me realize how much work we still have left to do. Charles nodded slowly, his gaze turning back to the park. There's always more work to do, he said quietly. But the important thing is that we keep going, that we don't give up. The man stood there for a moment, taking in Charles's words before finally offering his hand. Thank you, Mr. Thompson, for everything. Charles shook his hand, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Keep fighting, son, he said. Your father would be proud. As the man walked away, Charles felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had spent his life fighting for justice, for equality, for the simple right to exist in peace. And now, even in his later years, he could see the seeds of his labor beginning to sprout in the people around him. Oakwood Park was more than just a park. It was a testament to the power of community, of resilience, and of the enduring fight for a better world. And as long as people like Raymond Mitchell, the young activists, and Robert's son continued to stand up for what was right, Charles knew that his work would never be in vain. He stood up slowly, leaning on his cane for support. The day was far from over, and there were still battles to be fought. But for the first time in a long while, Charles felt hopeful that the future was in good hands. As Charles made his way home from Oakwood Park, his mind began to drift back through time. The confrontation with Officer Daniels had stirred up memories that he had long tried to push aside. His life had been a tapestry woven with moments of struggle, triumph, and deep loss, all tied together by a relentless pursuit of justice. Charles had been born in 1940, in a small house not far from where Oakwood Park now stood. Back then, the neighborhood had been a far cry from the well-manicured lawns and tidy homes that now lined the streets. It was a patchwork of rundown buildings and vacant lots, many of which housed families like his, families who lived under the oppressive shadow of segregation. His parents were hard-working people, both factory workers who had struggled to make ends meet. His father, James Thompson, had always been quiet and reserved, a man of few words, but strong principles. His mother, Evelyn, had been the heart of the family, her warm smile and gentle encouragement keeping them going through the tough times. It was his mother who had instilled in him the belief that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, it was possible to make a difference. "Charles," she would say, "the world may be tough, but you've got to be tougher. You've got to stand up for yourself and for others. That's the only way things will ever change." Her words echoed in his mind as he grew older, and by the time he was a teenager, Charles was already aware of the deep injustices that surrounded him. The whites-only signs, the segregated schools, the constant disrespect from people who didn't even know him, it all planted a seed of defiance within him. But it wasn't until the mid-1950s that Charles truly found his calling. He was just 15 when he attended his first civil rights meeting in the basement of a local church. The room had been packed with people from all walks of life, young and old, men and women, all of them determined to fight for a better future. Charles had squeezed into a seat at the back of the room, his heart pounding with both excitement and fear. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew that something important was happening, something that he wanted to be a part of. At the front of the room, a man with a booming voice was speaking, his words filled with passion and conviction. "We cannot wait for change to come to us," the man had declared, his voice rising above the murmur of the crowd. "We must be the change we wish to see in our community. We must stand up together and demand what is rightfully ours." Those words lit a fire within Charles. As he looked around the room, he saw the faces of people who, like him, were determined to break free from the chains of oppression. And in that moment, Charles knew that he had found his purpose. He wasn't just going to stand by and watch as the world continued to mistreat people like him. He was going to do something about it. From that day forward, Charles threw himself into the civil rights movement. He attended every meeting he could, soaking up knowledge and strategies, learning from the leaders who had come before him. He participated in sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, his hands shaking with both fear and resolve as he endured the taunts and threats from angry white patrons. One memory in particular stood out. It was a sweltering summer day in 1958, and Charles, now 18, was standing with a group of protesters outside City Hall. They were demanding equal access to public facilities, parks, swimming pools, libraries, places that had been reserved for white citizens only. Charles held a sign that read, "Separate is not equal," his heart pounding in his chest as a police officer approached. The officer's face was twisted with disgust as he jabbed a finger at Charles's chest. "Clear out, boy," the officer growled. "You people don't belong here." Charles felt a surge of anger and fear, but he remembered the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who had spoken about nonviolence and dignity in the face of hatred. Charles took a deep breath and met the officer's gaze, refusing to back down. "Sir," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, "we have every right to be here. We're citizens, just like you, and we're asking for nothing more than what's fair and just." The officer's face reddened, but something in Charles's calm demeanor gave him pause. After a tense moment, the officer stepped back, muttering under his breath as he walked away. It was a small victory, but to Charles it felt monumental. He had stood his ground, peacefully but firmly, and he had made his voice heard. As the years passed, Charles became a respected leader in the community. He organized voter registration drives, led peaceful protests, and worked tirelessly to bridge the racial divide in his city. But for all the progress they made, there were still constant reminders of how far they had yet to go. In 1965, a pivotal moment arrived in Charles's life. The city council was considering plans for a new park in the neighborhood, and Charles saw an opportunity, not just for green space, but for healing and unity. He believed that this park could become a symbol of what the community could achieve when people worked together, regardless of race. The council chamber was packed that day as Charles stood to speak. He looked out at the sea of faces, black and white, young and old, and felt the weight of the moment. He knew that this was more than just a meeting about a park. This was about the future of their community. "Ladies and gentlemen of the council," he began, his voice strong and clear, "we have an opportunity here. An opportunity not just to build a park, but to build a community. This park can be a place where children of all races play together, where families gather, where we can begin to see each other as neighbors and friends, not as us and them." He paused, looking each council member in the eye. "I'm asking you to let us be part of this process. Let us help design this park. Let it be a symbol of what we can achieve when we work together." There was a moment of silence, and then a councilwoman spoke up. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice filled with respect, "your words are powerful. I move that we create a community committee, led by Mr. Thompson, to work with our Parks Department on this project." The motion passed unanimously, and for Charles, it was one of the proudest moments of his life. Over the next year, he worked closely with the Parks Department and a diverse committee of community members to design Oakwood Park. Every decision was made with intention: the layout of the paths, the placement of benches, the types of trees and flowers to be planted. When the park finally opened in 1966, it was a joyous occasion. Children of all races played together on the new equipment, their laughter filling the air. Families spread picnic blankets on the grass, and the mayor shook Charles's hand, beaming with pride. "Mr. Thompson," the mayor had said, "you've given this city a great gift. This park is more than just trees and grass. It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we come together." Charles nodded, too overcome with emotion to speak. He looked around at the park, his park, their park, and felt a deep sense of accomplishment. It wasn't the end of their struggles, but it was a beautiful beginning. From that day forward, Oakwood Park became the heart of the community. Charles organized regular meetings there, bringing people together to discuss issues and work toward solutions. The park became a safe space for dialogue, for building understanding across racial lines. As the decades passed, Charles remained a pillar of the community. He served on the city council for several terms, always advocating for equality and justice. He mentored young activists, sharing the lessons he had learned during the civil rights movement. In 1990, on the 25th anniversary of Oakwood Park's opening, the city honored Charles for his contributions. The mayor's voice rang out across the park as she dedicated a fountain in his name. "It is my great honor to dedicate this fountain to Charles Thompson, a man who has given so much to our community. May the flowing water remind us of the constant effort needed to nurture understanding and equality." Charles, his hair now gray, stood with tears in his eyes as the plaque was unveiled. It read, "The Charles Thompson Fountain, in honor of a man who brought our community together and helped justice flow like a mighty stream. But as the applause died down, Charles couldn't help but feel a sense of unfinished business. Yes, they had made progress. Yes, the park was a symbol of hope. But there were still whispers of division, still moments where the past bled into the present. One morning, about a year before the incident with Officer Daniels, Charles had a conversation in the park that had stuck with him. A young black woman had sat down next to him on the bench, her sleeping baby cradled in her arms. She had looked tired, worried, as if the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. "Excuse me," she had said hesitantly. "Are you Mr. Thompson? The one they named the fountain after?" Charles had smiled, nodding. "That's me," he replied. "And who might you be?" The young woman introduced herself as Shanice, a new resident in the neighborhood. As they spoke, she had asked him a question that had lingered in his mind ever since. "Do you ever feel like nothing's really changed?" she had asked, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "My brother was stopped by the police last week, right here in the park. They said he looked suspicious. He was just playing basketball with his friends." Charles had felt a familiar ache in his chest, a mix of heartache and sorrow. He had reached out and gently patted Shanice's hand. "Things have changed," he had said, his voice gentle but firm. "But not enough. Not nearly enough." Officer Daniels sat in the stiff-backed chair, his hands clasped nervously in his lap, his eyes darting around the sparse office. The tension in the room was palpable, and he could feel the weight of the mistake he had made that morning pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. The door opened quietly, and Chief Raymond Mitchell entered the room, his expression unreadable. "Officer Daniels," the chief began, closing the door behind him and taking a seat across from the younger officer. "I've spoken to Mr. Thompson. I've reviewed the incident, and I've seen the footage from the park's surveillance cameras." Daniels swallowed hard, the reality of the situation hitting him full force. "Sir, Let me stop you right there," Mitchell interrupted, raising a hand. "This isn't the time for excuses. You know what you did. You know the consequences of your actions." Daniels could feel his pulse quicken. He had played the scenario over and over in his head, trying to figure out where it had gone wrong, but deep down, he knew. The moment he had laid eyes on Mr. Thompson, something had shifted in him. An unconscious bias, something he hadn't even realized was there, had taken over. "I didn't mean for it to escalate like that," Daniels said quietly, his voice trembling slightly. "I thought I was doing my job, but I made assumptions, and I acted on them. I know now that I was wrong." Chief Mitchell leaned forward, his expression still stern. "That's the problem, Daniels. You didn't think, you reacted. And in doing so, you violated the very oath you took when you joined this force. Protect and serve, not harass and intimidate." Daniels looked down at his hands, guilt washing over him. "I didn't realize who he was." "That doesn't matter," Mitchell snapped, his voice sharp. "It wouldn't matter if he was Charles Thompson or someone you'd never met. Your job is to treat every person in this community with respect, with dignity, regardless of their skin color or background." The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniels knew there was nothing he could say that would make up for what he had done. "What's going to happen to me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Chief Mitchell sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You've been suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation. Depending on the outcome, there will be further disciplinary action. But I can tell you right now, your future with this department is uncertain." Daniels nodded slowly, the gravity of the situation sinking in. He had always wanted to be a police officer, had grown up dreaming of serving his community. But now, in this moment, he wasn't sure if he deserved to wear the uniform anymore. Chief Mitchell's tone softened slightly. "Look, Daniels, I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're young, and you've made a mistake, a serious one. But mistakes like this can cost people their lives. Do you understand that?" Daniels nodded again, tears stinging the corners of his eyes. "I do, sir. I really do." Mitchell paused for a moment, studying the young officer's face. This isn't the end for you, Daniels, but you've got a lot of work to do if you want to earn back the trust of this community. That starts with taking responsibility for your actions. Daniels wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, nodding again. I'm ready to do whatever it takes. Mitchell leaned forward, his voice firm but encouraging. Good, because this community needs officers who don't just wear the badge. They need officers who understand what it means to serve, who understand the people they're protecting. Daniels remained silent, his heart heavy with the weight of his failure. As Mitchell stood to leave, he stopped at the door and turned back to him. I've arranged for you to meet with Mr. Thompson, Mitchell said. He's agreed to sit down with you. I suggest you use this opportunity wisely. It's not every day that a man like him is willing to talk to someone who's wronged him. Daniels's heart skipped a beat. The thought of facing Mr. Thompson after everything that had happened terrified him, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. He had to face the consequences of his actions, no matter how difficult it might be. Thank you, Chief, Daniels said quietly. Mitchell nodded, his expression softening just slightly before he left the room. The meeting was set for the following afternoon, back at Oakwood Park. Daniels arrived early, wearing plain clothes, his heart pounding as he approached the familiar bench where everything had unfolded just a few days earlier. The weight of what had happened still sat heavily on his chest, but now, as he looked around the peaceful park, the gravity of his actions felt even more profound. Charles Thompson was already seated on the bench, a familiar calmness about him as he sipped from a cup of coffee. He didn't look up when Daniels approached, but the younger man knew that Charles was aware of his presence. Mr. Thompson, Daniels began, his voice unsteady. I don't even know where to start. Charles slowly set down his coffee and turned to look at him, his gaze steady but not unkind. How about with the truth? He said, his voice gentle but firm. Why did you approach me that day? Daniels took a deep breath, sitting down on the edge of the bench, keeping his distance. I was on patrol, he started, choosing his words carefully. And when I saw you sitting there, You assumed I didn't belong, Charles finished for him, his tone even. Because of the color of my skin. Daniels winced, the truth of the statement hitting him like a punch to the gut. Yes, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. I did, and I'm so sorry for that. Charles watched him for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity of his apology. Do you know how many times I've been in that position, Officer Daniels? He asked quietly. How many times I've had to prove that I belonged in a place I've lived in for decades? Daniels swallowed hard, feeling the shame rise in his throat. I can't imagine, sir. No, you can't, Charles agreed. And that's the problem. You saw me as a threat, as someone who didn't fit into your idea of what this community should look like. But what you didn't see was the man sitting in front of you. The man who helped build this community, who's lived here longer than you've been alive. Daniels nodded, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. I know, and I hate that I did that to you. Charles sighed softly, leaning back on the bench. I've spent my entire life fighting for a world where people wouldn't have to go through what I've been through. But here we are, in 2024, and I'm still fighting the same battles. Do you understand how exhausting that is? Daniels couldn't hold back the tears any longer. I'm so sorry, Mr. Thompson. I never meant to hurt you, and I'll never forgive myself for what I did. Charles was silent for a moment, letting the weight of Daniels' apology hang in the air. Finally, he spoke, his voice softer than before. I don't need you to punish yourself for what happened, he said. What I need is for you to learn from this, to understand the power you hold as a police officer, and to use it to protect, not to harm. Daniels wiped his eyes, nodding quickly. I will. I swear I will. I want to be better. I want to do better. Charles nodded slowly, his gaze softening. That's all I ask. If you can promise me that you'll take this experience and use it to change the way you approach your job, then maybe, just maybe, something good can come out of all this. Daniels looked up at Charles, his heart full of gratitude. "I promise, sir. I'll do whatever it takes." The two men sat in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation settling over them like a blanket. Eventually, Charles stood, his cane supporting him as he rose to his feet. "Thank you for coming, Officer Daniels," Charles said, offering the younger man a small, tired smile. "I hope this is just the beginning of the changes we need to see." Daniels stood as well, nodding earnestly. "Thank you for giving me the chance to apologize, Mr. Thompson. I won't let you down." Charles nodded one last time before turning and slowly walking away, his figure disappearing down the familiar paths of Oakwood Park. As Daniels watched him go, he felt a mixture of shame, relief, and a newfound sense of purpose. He knew that earning back the trust of the community would take time, but for the first time since the incident, he felt like he was on the right path. In the weeks following Officer Daniels' apology and the community's growing outrage over the incident, a shift began to take place in Oakwood Park and the surrounding neighborhood. People who had once remained silent were now speaking up, voicing their frustrations, their hopes, and their demands for change. And at the heart of this movement was Charles Thompson, though he had begun to step back, allowing the younger generation to take center stage. Charles had always believed that true change would only come when the next generation took up the fight. He had seen too many movements falter when they relied too heavily on one or two charismatic leaders. That's why, over the years, he had made it his mission to mentor and empower young people who were passionate about justice and equality. Now, that investment was paying off. On a crisp fall morning, just a few weeks after the incident with Officer Daniels, Charles found himself sitting once again on his favorite bench in Oakwood Park. The air was filled with the sounds of children playing, dogs barking, and the distant hum of traffic. But there was something new in the air too. Something vibrant, something powerful. A group of young activists had gathered near the fountain that bore Charles's name, organizing for a town hall meeting that was scheduled for later that day. They were talking with residents, passing out flyers, and setting up chairs in a semicircle around the fountain. Leading the effort was Shanice, the young woman Charles had met in the park a year earlier. Charles watched her with a sense of pride, seeing how she had grown into her role as a community leader. She moved confidently through the crowd, her baby now a toddler at her side, her voice carrying the same conviction that Charles had once seen in himself so many years ago. Shanice was a force to be reckoned with, smart, passionate, and unafraid to speak truth to power. "Mr. Thompson," Shanice called out as she spotted Charles sitting on the bench. She walked over with a smile, her son holding tightly to her hand. "I was hoping you'd come today." Charles chuckled, pushing himself to stand with the help of his cane. "You know I wouldn't miss it for the world. What you're doing here, Shanice, it's exactly what this community needs." Shanice beamed with pride. "We're trying. It's not always easy, but with everything that's been happening, people are more motivated than ever to make changes." Charles nodded, looking around at the bustling activity in the park. "I can see that. And it's a beautiful thing. But don't underestimate how hard the road ahead is going to be. It's not just about making noise. It's about sustaining this momentum, making sure that real, lasting change happens." Shanice's smile faded slightly, but her determination remained. "I know. That's why we're working on building more than just protests and town halls. We're trying to create programs, real, tangible solutions for the problems we face. Housing, education, policing, it's all connected, and we want to tackle it all." Charles felt a wave of pride swell in his chest. "You're thinking big, Shanice. That's good. You can't just focus on one issue and hope that everything else will fall into place. You need to look at the whole system. And I can tell you from experience that's the hardest part." Shanice nodded, glancing down at her son, who was tugging on her sleeve. "We're starting with the police department," she said. "Chief Mitchell's been really receptive to our ideas, and we're working on a community oversight board that'll help hold officers accountable. It's a start, but it feels like the right direction." Charles raised an eyebrow, intrigued. A community oversight board? That's ambitious, and exactly what this place needs. It's what you taught us, Shanice said with a smile. You told us to think about what's possible, not just what's easy. That stuck with me. Charles smiled, feeling the warmth of her words settle over him. You've got the right mindset, Shanice. And if anyone can make this happen, it's you. Shanice laughed, her son pulling her toward the gathering crowd near the fountain. I'd better get back to it, she said. The town hall's about to start, and I need to make sure everything's in place. Charles watched as she walked away, her toddler trailing behind her. The sight filled him with hope. He had seen so many young leaders come and go over the years, but there was something special about Shanice and the group she had gathered. They weren't just fighting for change, they were building the foundations for it. As the crowd began to grow near the fountain, Charles made his way over, taking a seat near the back. The town hall was informal, with people from all walks of life gathering to share their thoughts and concerns about the issues facing the community. A microphone had been set up near the fountain, and as people began to speak, Charles listened carefully, his heart swelling with pride at the courage and clarity of the voices he heard. One by one, residents stepped up to the microphone, speaking about their experiences with housing discrimination, police misconduct, and the lack of resources in the neighborhood schools. There was frustration, yes, but there was also hope, a hope that hadn't been there before. These weren't just complaints, they were calls to action, demands for accountability, and most importantly, offers to help create solutions. Shanice took the microphone at one point, her voice ringing out clearly over the assembled crowd. We've been asking for change for too long, she said, her tone resolute. Now it's time for us to demand it. But demanding change isn't enough. We need to build it ourselves, from the ground up. We need to work together, not just to hold those in power accountable, but to create the kind of community we want to live in. The crowd erupted in applause, and Charles couldn't help but join in. This was the future he had fought for. The future he had dreamed of all those years ago when he had stood at the city council meeting, fighting for Oakwood Park to become a place of unity and peace. As the town hall continued, Charles noticed another familiar face in the crowd. It was Marcus, Shanice's brother, the young man who had been stopped by the police in the park months earlier. He had grown since then, not just in stature, but in confidence. Marcus had become an outspoken advocate for youth in the community, leading mentorship programs for at-risk teens and organizing basketball tournaments at the park to keep kids engaged and off the streets. After the town hall ended, Marcus made his way over to Charles, his usual grin in place. "Mr. Thompson," he greeted warmly, "how have you been?" Charles smiled, extending his hand to Marcus. "I'm doing just fine, son, and it looks like you've been keeping busy." Marcus laughed, scratching the back of his head. "Yeah, well, someone's got to look after these kids. I figured I'd do what I can." "You're doing more than that," Charles said. "I've seen the work you've been doing with the youth programs. It's exactly what this community needs. Keep at it." Marcus nodded, his grin fading slightly. "It's not always easy, though. Sometimes it feels like for every step forward, we're taking 2 steps back. But seeing what Shanice is doing, seeing all these people come together today, it makes me think we might actually be able to make a difference." Charles nodded. "That's how it starts, one step at a time. You can't expect change to come all at once. But the fact that you're here, that you're putting in the work, that's what makes the difference." Marcus looked thoughtful for a moment before glancing over at the crowd. "You ever think things will really change? Like for good?" Charles chuckled softly. "I wouldn't be sitting here if I didn't. I've been through too much to think otherwise. Change is slow, Marcus. It's frustrating, and it doesn't always come when we want it to. But it does come. And if people like you and your sister keep fighting, then I have no doubt that things will change for the better." Marcus smiled, clearly heartened by Charles's words. "Thanks, Mr. Thompson. That means a lot." As Marcus walked away, Charles leaned back in his chair, feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun on his face. The town hall had been a success, but more importantly, it had shown that the next generation was ready to take the reins. Later that afternoon, as the crowd began to disperse, Shanice and Marcus rejoined Charles at the fountain, sitting beside him on the bench. They had both been the driving force behind the day's events, and Charles could see the exhaustion on their faces. "You both did well today," Charles said, nodding approvingly. "This is how change happens." Shanice smiled tiredly. "We're trying, Mr. Thompson. It's a lot of work, but we've got a good team." "You do," Charles agreed. "And you're doing it the right way, by bringing people together, by listening to their voices. That's how you build something that lasts." Marcus leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "We were talking earlier about how we want to take this even further," he said, glancing at his sister. "We're thinking about running for local office, maybe even getting involved in city government. That way, we can push for the changes we want from the inside." Charles raised his eyebrows, impressed. "That's ambitious," he said with a smile. "But I think it's exactly what you should do. If you want to make real change, you've got to get into the places where decisions are being made. And the two of you are more than capable of doing that." Shanice and Marcus exchanged a look, clearly excited by the idea. "We've got a lot of planning to do," Shanice said, "but it feels like the right move." Charles nodded, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. The future was in good hands. Shanice, Marcus, and the others, they weren't just talking about change, they were making it happen. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over the park, Charles stood up, leaning on his cane. "I'm proud of both of you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You've taken everything we've fought for and turned it into something real, something that will last." Shanice stood up as well, hugging Charles tightly. "We wouldn't be here without you, Mr. Thompson," she said softly. "You've shown us the way." Marcus joined in, wrapping his arms around both of them. "Yeah, Mr. T, you've always been our guide." Charles chuckled, hugging them both back. "I'm just happy to see you two leading the way now. Keep going. Don't stop. This is your time." As the three of them stood there, embraced by the fading light of the day, Charles felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The seeds he had planted so many years ago were finally bearing fruit, and the future looked brighter than it had in a long time. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Oakwood Park once again became the center of community life, just as Charles Thompson had envisioned all those years ago. The trees that had stood as silent witnesses to decades of history were budding with new leaves, a reminder of the constant cycle of growth and renewal. For Charles, the park had always been more than just a place to relax. It was a symbol of the fight for justice, a fight that had begun long before the park's creation and would continue long after he was gone. Now, as the sun began to set on his life, Charles felt a sense of peace, knowing that the future was in good hands. The Bridge Builders program, which had been spearheaded by Charles and Chief Mitchell in the wake of Officer Daniel's misconduct, had flourished beyond anyone's expectations. What had begun as a small initiative to improve relations between the police and the community had grown into something much larger, a citywide effort to address the systemic issues that had plagued the community for so long. One bright Saturday afternoon, a large gathering was held at Oakwood Park to celebrate the success of the Bridge Builders program. The park was filled with people from all walks of life: families, activists, city officials, police officers, all coming together to recognize the progress that had been made and to recommit to the work that still lay ahead. A stage had been set up near the Charles Thompson Fountain, and as people took their seats, a palpable sense of excitement filled the air. There was a feeling of unity, of shared purpose, that hadn't been felt in the community in years. It was a sign that things were changing, not just on the surface, but at a deeper, more meaningful level. Charles sat in the front row, surrounded by the people he had mentored and fought alongside for so many years. Shanice was there, her young son sitting on her lap. Marcus stood nearby, talking with a group of teens from his mentorship program. Chief Mitchell was in attendance as well, along with several other officers who had been instrumental in the success of the Bridge Builders program. As the ceremony began, the mayor of the city, Evelyn Rodriguez, took the stage. She was a dynamic leader in her early 40s who had been elected on a platform of community renewal and social justice. Her presence at the event was a testament to how far the city had come in addressing the issues of the past. Ladies and gentlemen, Mayor Rodriguez began, her voice clear and strong. We are here today to celebrate something extraordinary. The Bridge Builders program has not only brought our community together, but it has also set a new standard for how we approach policing, housing, education, and equity in this city. The crowd applauded, and Charles smiled, feeling the warmth of their appreciation. But we wouldn't be here today, the mayor continued, if it weren't for the vision and leadership of one man, a man who has spent his entire life fighting for justice, equality, and the well-being of this community. Charles Thompson, would you please join me on stage? The crowd erupted into cheers and applause as Charles, with the help of his cane, slowly stood up. Shanice and Marcus were at his side immediately, offering their arms to steady him as he made his way to the stage. As Charles approached the podium, the crowd quieted down, their attention fully focused on the man who had become a living legend in their community. Mayor Rodriguez stepped aside, handing the microphone to Charles, who took it with a gracious nod. For a moment, Charles stood in silence, taking in the sight of the crowd before him. These were the people he had fought for, the people he had spent his life trying to uplift. Seeing them all here, united in a common cause, filled him with an overwhelming sense of pride. Thank you, Charles began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Thank you for this incredible honor. But I have to tell you, this isn't just about me. This is about all of us, the people who have worked so hard to make this community what it is today. He paused, his eyes scanning the faces of the people he had come to know so well over the years. When we built this park all those years ago, we weren't just planting trees and laying down paths. We were planting the seeds of something much bigger, something that would grow over time, nourished by the love and dedication of everyone in this community. The crowd listened intently, many nodding in agreement. And now, Charles continued, we're seeing the fruits of that labor. We're seeing what's possible when people come together, when they put aside their differences and work toward a common goal. The Bridge Builders program is a perfect example of that. It shows us what we can achieve when we refuse to be divided, when we choose to see each other as neighbors and friends instead of enemies. Another round of applause broke out, and Charles smiled, feeling the energy of the crowd. But there's still work to be done, he said, his voice growing more serious. We've come a long way, but the journey isn't over. There are still people in this city who feel unheard, who feel like they don't belong. It's our job, all of us, to keep pushing forward, to keep fighting for a future where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. Charles glanced over at Shanice and Marcus, both of whom were watching him with admiration. And I know we can do it, he said, his voice softening, because I see the next generation standing right here. I see young people who are ready to take up the fight, who are ready to lead us into a brighter, more just future. The crowd erupted into applause once more, and Charles felt a wave of emotion wash over him. This was the culmination of everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed. But more than that, it was a beginning, a new chapter in the story of this community. As the applause died down, Mayor Rodriguez returned to the podium, a broad smile on her face. Thank you, Mr. Thompson, she said. Your words, as always, are an inspiration to us all. She turned to face the crowd. In honor of Mr. Thompson's lifetime of service to this community, the city has decided to make an important change. From this day forward, Oakwood Park will be known as Charles Thompson Park. The crowd roared with approval, and Charles felt his breath catch in his throat. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't asked for it. But hearing those words, knowing that the place he had helped create would forever bear his name, it was overwhelming. The mayor raised her hands to quiet the crowd. But that's not all, she said, her voice full of excitement. "We're also launching a new initiative, the Charles Thompson Leadership Fellowship. This program will provide young people in our community with the resources and mentorship they need to become the next generation of leaders, just like Mr. Thompson has done for so many of us." Tears welled up in Charles's eyes as the crowd once again erupted in applause. The Charles Thompson Leadership Fellowship? It was exactly what he had hoped for, a way to ensure that the work he had started would continue long after he was gone. As the ceremony came to a close, Charles was surrounded by friends, family, and well-wishers, all of them eager to congratulate him on the incredible honor. But despite the accolades, Charles remained humble, constantly reminding everyone that this was about the community, not about him. Later that evening, after the crowd had dispersed and the park had grown quiet, Charles sat alone on his favorite bench, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was cool and crisp, and the sound of the fountain gently bubbling nearby brought him a sense of peace. He thought about his life, about all the struggles he had faced, and the victories he had won. He thought about the people he had lost along the way, and the new friends he had made. And most of all, he thought about the future that Shanice, Marcus, and the other young leaders would help build. Charles smiled to himself, feeling a deep sense of contentment. His work wasn't finished, but it didn't need to be. He had done his part. Now it was time for the next generation to carry the torch. As he sat there, the stars beginning to twinkle in the night sky, Charles closed his eyes and listened to the sounds of the park that now bore his name. He felt the presence of those who had come before him, the echoes of their struggles and their triumphs. And in that moment, Charles Thompson knew that he had left the world a better place than he had found it. The legacy of Oakwood Park, now Charles Thompson Park, would live on, a testament to the power of community, of perseverance, and of hope. It would stand as a reminder that even in the face of great adversity, change was always possible. And as long as there were people willing to fight for it, the dream of justice and equality would never die. As the days turned into weeks and the initial excitement of the park's rededication began to settle, the community's energy did not wane. In fact, the renaming of Oakwood Park to Charles Thompson Park and the launch of the Charles Thompson Leadership Fellowship had ignited a new flame of activism and community involvement. People from all walks of life, young and old, were stepping up to take on leadership roles, eager to continue the work that Charles and the previous generation had started. The Bridge Builders program continued to expand, gaining recognition not just within the city but throughout the state. It became a model for other communities facing similar challenges, demonstrating how meaningful change could happen when people worked together to build trust, accountability, and mutual respect. Shanice and Marcus had both become key figures in local government, with Shanice spearheading new initiatives focused on housing reform and education, while Marcus continued his work with at-risk youth, expanding his mentorship program into surrounding neighborhoods. They were both shining examples of the legacy that Charles had nurtured, and their work was already making a profound impact on the lives of countless people. Charles, meanwhile, found himself stepping further into the background, content to watch the fruits of his labor blossom in the capable hands of the younger generation. He still attended meetings, still offered guidance when asked, but more often than not, he was simply a quiet observer, happy to see the community he had loved for so long thriving. One evening, as Charles sat on the porch of his home, reflecting on the journey he had been on, he received a call from Chief Mitchell. "Charles," Mitchell said, his voice warm and familiar, "I just wanted to let you know that we've finalized the changes to the police department's community engagement protocols. The new guidelines are being implemented starting next month. I couldn't have done this without you." Charles smiled into the phone, his heart swelling with pride. "Raymond, you did the hard work. I just gave you a little nudge in the right direction." Mitchell chuckled. "A little nudge? You've been the guiding force behind all of this. Don't be modest, Charles. You've changed the way we think about policing in this city." Now, Charles shook his head, though Mitchell couldn't see it. "I didn't do it alone. It's been a collective effort, and now it's up to all of you to keep it going." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and then Mitchell spoke again, his voice quieter, more thoughtful. "Charles, I just want to say thank you for everything. You've been a mentor to me and to so many others. I hope you know how much of an impact you've had." Charles felt a lump form in his throat. "I do, Raymond, and I'm grateful for that. But I'm more grateful to see what you and the others are doing. That's what this is all about. The next generation taking up the torch." After the call ended, Charles sat quietly on his porch, the soft sounds of the neighborhood filling the evening air. He thought about all the people who had been part of his journey, his parents, his friends from the civil rights movement, the countless community members who had fought alongside him over the years. So many of them were gone now, but their spirit lived on in the work that continued. The next morning, Charles made his way to Charles Thompson Park for what had become his daily routine. He greeted familiar faces as he walked along the well-worn paths, feeling the cool breeze on his face. When he reached his favorite bench, he sat down with a contented sigh, watching the world go by. The park was bustling with life, as it always was. Children played on the swings, parents chatted while keeping a watchful eye on their little ones, and joggers made their way along the winding paths. In the distance, a group of teens gathered on the basketball court, laughing and shouting as they played. Charles smiled as he watched them, his thoughts drifting back to his own youth. He had spent so many years fighting for moments like this, for a world where people of all races and backgrounds could come together in peace and unity. And now, here it was, right before his eyes. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, Charles leaned back on the bench and closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the park wash over him. He had lived a long life, a full life, and he had no regrets. He had seen the world change in ways he had once only dreamed of, and he knew that the work would continue long after he was gone. And that was the beauty of it all. Charles Thompson had never wanted to be a hero or a legend. He had only ever wanted to make the world a little bit better, to leave behind a legacy of love, justice, and hope. And now, as he sat in the park that bore his name, he knew that he had done just that. The future was bright. The next generation had taken up the torch, and they were carrying it with a strength and determination that filled Charles with pride. His work was done, but theirs was just beginning. And that, to Charles, was the greatest legacy he could have ever hoped for. As he sat there, surrounded by the sounds of life, of community, and of progress, Charles smiled. The fight for justice would never truly end, but as long as there were people willing to take it up, there would always be hope. And that was enough. Charles Thompson's story is one of resilience, perseverance, and the belief that real change can only come from working together as a community. He dedicated his life to building bridges across divides, and his legacy lives on through the next generation of leaders who are committed to continuing his work. If you've been inspired by Charles's journey, now is the time to take action. Get involved in your local community, support initiatives that promote equality and justice, and most importantly, lift up the voices of those who have been silenced for too long. Each of us has the power to make a difference, just as Charles did. Together, we can build a better, more just world for ourselves and future generations. So, what will you do to continue the legacy of people like Charles Thompson? How will you stand up for justice and make your community a better place? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of hope, resilience, and change.